There's a kind of person the world misunderstands until they are no longer afraid of walking alone. A person whose silence is not emptiness, but depth. A person who has always felt the world a little too sharply, a little too honestly, and therefore learned the art of retreat long before they learn the language of confidence. They move quietly. They observe more than they speak. They speak only when something inside them feels real enough to leave the safety of their inner world. They are called distant, reserved, mysterious. Anything to avoid the truth that their solitude is not a wound, but a doorway. And if you watch them closely, you begin to notice something unusual. They are not lonely. They are simply unwilling to dilute themselves. All their life, they've been told that having few friends is a flaw, that silence is a problem to be fixed, that choosing your own company is evidence of some hidden sadness. But deep down, they know something different. They know that you cannot hear your own truth in a crowded room. They know that connection means nothing if it costs you your authenticity. They know that some souls come into this world carved for depth, and depth, by its very nature, creates distance. Jung said that loneliness comes not from having no people around you, but from being unable to share what feels meaningful to you. The silent ones carry this truth, like a heartbeat. They do not fear the absence of people. They fear the absence of meaning. There is a moment in their life, often early, often quietly, when they realize they do not fit into the rhythm of the world around them. They watch others bond effortlessly, laugh loudly, leap into conversations as if words cost nothing. Meanwhile, they feel each social interaction like a subtle negotiation between honesty and performance. They wonder why their energy drains so quickly, why noise feels suffocating, why they feel more alive sitting alone at a window than in the middle of a crowded celebration. Why do I feel more myself when no one is around? They ask in moments of honesty, and the answer comes in a whisper, because no one is bending you out of shape. Their solitude is not cold. It is warm, steady, grounding. It is the place where they return to themselves after the world has demanded too many versions of them. They walk through life like people carrying a fragile, glowing lantern inside their chests, protecting from the winds of expectation. They retreat, not because they dislike others, but because the light dims when too many hands reach for it. They have learned to guard their energy the way others guard their reputation, not out of fear, but out of reverence. There's a unique pain they carry, however, a quiet ache born from years of being misunderstood. People assume they're withdrawn because something broke inside them. They assume their solitude is a symptom. They assume their silence is a warning sign. But the silent ones know the truth. Their nature is not a disorder. It is a design. They were not built for the shallow end of the pool. They were built for the deep waters where most people never swim. And yet, the world keeps trying to convince them that something is wrong. Teachers ask why they don't speak more. Friends ask why they disappear for days. Family members question why they're too picky with relationships. They learn early that extroversion is praised, while introspection is quietly judged. So they adapt. They learn how to mimic openness. They learn how to smile at the right time, nod at the right words, laugh at the right cues. But inside, they feel the hollowness of performance, the ache of being present but not seen, the exhaustion of being social but not understood. Slowly, they begin to withdraw, not emotionally, but spiritually. They feel the subtle pull toward their inner world, a place where conversations are honest, where their thoughts are safe, where their intuition finally gets room to speak. They start choosing quality over quantity, depth over noise, alignment over approval. And suddenly, solitude stops feeling like isolation. It begins to feel like oxygen. They notice that clarity comes in quiet places. Answers arrive when the world sleeps. Their true personality blooms when no eyes are watching. They realize that silence is not the absence of life. It is the birthplace of it. Every insight they've had, every awakening, every turning point emerged not from social crowds, but from solitary moments when the soul finally had space to speak. So they let themselves become what they were always meant to be. People who walk the world softly but see it clearly. They begin to understand that the fewer people they allow close, the more aligned those connections become. They notice that their best ideas appear when they're alone. Their deepest healing happens when they stop running from themselves. Their strongest self emerges not in company, but in solitude, where no one else's voice interrupts their own. They realize the world mistakes silence for weakness. But silence is where their power begins. The power to think deeply, to feel honestly, to choose intentionally, to see through illusions, to walk away from shallow relationships, to protect their inner world. They are the people who turn down invitations not out of avoidance, but out of integrity. They are the ones who can sit with their thoughts without craving distraction. The ones who can watch their emotions rise and fall like tides without drowning in them. The ones who understand that solitude is not punishment, it is medicine. But beneath that quiet strength lies a truth even they take time to accept. Solitude is the environment where their identity becomes unmistakably clear. Away from others, they discover what is truly theirs, what beliefs are authentic, what dreams are real, what wounds need healing, what desires are calling. They realize that every time they step away from the world, they step closer to themselves. And this is the moment when everything changes. Because once a person learns who they are in silence, the world can no longer convince them to be someone else. They start noticing the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness feels like hunger. Solitude feels like nourishment. Loneliness aches for connection. Solitude creates it within themselves. Loneliness begs for distraction. Solitude invites awareness. Loneliness happens when you abandon yourself to chase others. Solitude begins when you return home to your own soul. They see how few people in the world are truly comfortable being alone. How most cling to noise because silence exposes truths they are not ready to see. But the silent ones were born with a different orientation. They do not fear their inner world. They fear losing it. They fear environments where they're forced to betray themselves. They fear relationships where honesty becomes a compromise. They fear lifestyles that demand performance instead of presence. So they choose differently. They choose to move slowly, to speak intentionally, to listen deeply, to love selectively, to build a small circle that feels like truth instead of a large one that feels like noise. They are not hiding from the world. They are curating their life. In time, people begin to misunderstand them less. Their quiet confidence becomes noticeable. Their solitude looks less like withdrawal and more like clarity. Others see that their presence carries weight precisely because it is not given lightly. They become the person whose words matter because they are rare. The person whose silence is felt because it is alive. The person whose gaze seems to see through everything false. What the world calls antisocial, Jung called individuation, the process of becoming yourself fully, without distortion. And the silent ones embody this perfectly. They do not lose themselves in crowds. They do not scatter their energy carelessly. They do not chase belonging. They build it. They do not fear being misunderstood. They fear abandoning their depth for acceptance. And as they walk further along their path, something unexpected happens. They stop defending their solitude. They stop explaining their silence. They stop apologizing for their distance. They realize they owe the world their integrity, not their constant availability. They realize that the people meant for them will never be intimidated by their depth. They realize that walking alone is not a tragedy. It is a transition, a refinement, a rite of passage, because eventually, those who can walk alone walk farther. Those who can think alone think clearer. Those who can feel alone feel more authentically. And those who can stand alone stand stronger. When the silent ones finally stop fearing their solitude, they step into a version of themselves the world cannot dismiss anymore. A version unshaken by opinions. A version unmoved by noise. A version that understands a simple, quiet truth. You were never meant to belong everywhere. You were meant to belong where your soul feels safe to speak. And once you understand that, you stop chasing crowds. You start choosing truth. You start choosing yourself. When you refuse to wear a mask, the world begins to step away. At first, you think it's something you did, something you said, something about you that pushed people away. But with time, you begin to understand that authenticity, in its truest form, has a strange consequence. It subtracts before it adds. The more honest a person becomes, the smaller their circle grows. Not because they are unworthy of connection, but because genuine connection cannot survive in the same space as pretense. And so the world, sensing the weight of your truth, quietly rearranges itself. People who once felt close begin to keep a distance without explanation. Conversations that once flowed now feel slightly out of rhythm. Invitations become rare, then silent. And inside, the unmasked soul feels something shift. Not a heartbreak, not an anger, something quieter, a realization. The world is comfortable with a version of you that does not challenge its illusions. The version that smiles on cue, nods politely, never asks real questions, never reveals a depth pulsing beneath the surface of your every thought. But the moment you decide to show your real self, something changes. You stop being familiar. You become unsettling. It is not that people dislike authenticity. They admire from afar, like a fire they want to warm their hands by without getting too close. But when that fire burns inside a person, when it exposes every wound, every truth, every contradiction, many cannot bear the reflection it forces upon them. Authenticity does not merely show who you are. It silently reveals who others are pretending to be. And most people are not ready for that kind of clarity. The unmasked soul learns this early. They learn it the hard way, often through relationships that collapse under the gravity of honesty. They begin to see that every time they express something from the depths, an emotion, a boundary, a truth, the room changes. The air shifts. The dynamic rearranges. People sit up straighter. Some withdraw. Some defend. Some pretend they didn't hear. Few lean in. It is in these moments they realize that authenticity, though beautiful, is expensive. The cost is people, not because they leave maliciously, but because emotional honesty exposes a gap they never intended to close. When your truth steps into the light, their comfort steps out. When you say, "This hurt me," those who rely on your silence feel threatened. When you say, "I cannot betray myself anymore," those who benefited from your self-abandonment feel inconvenienced. When you say, "This is who I really am," the ones who love the idea of you more than you feel confused. Authenticity simplifies everything, but simplicity has a price. Illusions fall away. Truth filters people the way storms clear dead branches from trees. Not violently, but inevitably. The more real you become, the more the artificial fades. The more honest you become, the more the dishonest retreat. The more you show your soul, the more you discover which connections were never built to carry its weight. And somewhere along this journey, something inside the authentic person whispers, "I cannot pretend to be smaller than I am." It doesn't sound rebellious. It sounds tired. A soul weariness that comes from years of shape-shifting, from decades of being everything except what they truly felt. Jung believed that every human undergoes a process called individuation, a deep internal shift where the false layers of the personality begin to fall away. Masks crack, roles dissolve, old identities crumble, and the person begins to live from their core instead of their conditioning. But individuation, he said, makes you a stranger in your own world for a while. As the unmasked soul grows, the world shrinks. The circle tightens, not by force, but by natural selection. Authenticity has its own gravitational field. It keeps only what resonates. Not everyone can follow. Some find the honesty too heavy. Some find the clarity too illuminating. Some find the emotional depth too confronting. And some simply do not care to understand. But the authentic person cannot turn back. The moment they taste the freedom of truth, they lose the ability to tolerate anything less. They can no longer sit at tables where their silence is required. They can no longer fake laughter to maintain comfort. They can no longer hold relationships that depend on their absence. They begin to walk through life with a certain kind of quiet courage. Not loud, not defiant, just unwilling to dilute themselves. When someone asks, "What's wrong?" they no longer swallow their truth. When someone crosses a boundary, they no longer smile to keep the peace. When a relationship feels misaligned, they no longer force themselves to stay. They become loyal to themselves in ways they once reserved for others. And this loyalty reshapes everything. People who were drawn to their softness recoil at their firmness. People who love their empathy grow uneasy with their clarity. People who depended on their compliance become uncomfortable with their boundaries. But this discomfort is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that the unmasked soul is finally being seen, not admired, not consumed. Seen. There's a loneliness in this stage, a subtle grief, the kind that doesn't come from being alone, but from realizing how many relationships were built on versions of you that no longer exist. They feel a quiet mourning for the masks they once wore, because those masks protected them, even if they suffocated them. They feel a soft sadness of the people who step away, because they once mistook those people for home. They feel a heavy silence, the kind where the heart asks, is this what authenticity costs? Yes, but the question changes. Is the cost worth the freedom? And the answer, whispered slowly from the soul, is always yes. Because in the emptiness left behind by inauthentic relationships, space is created. Space for those who see you clearly. Space for those who match your honesty. Space for connections that do not collapse under truth, but are strengthened by it. Authentic people attract fewer companions, but the ones who remain are those who do not fear depth. They are the ones who do not step back when your truth steps forward. As the unmasked soul continues to grow, they realize something profound. Truth does not isolate you. It filters you. It removes those who could not be trusted with your reality. It clears the path so the right ones can finally walk toward you. Authenticity does not break your social circle. It reveals it, and slowly, gently, they begin to understand why their circle grew smaller. It wasn't rejection. It was alignment. It wasn't loss. It was refinement. It wasn't failure. It was evolution. The unmasked soul no longer begs for understanding. They no longer chase acceptance. They no longer cling to relationships that require their disappearance. They stand in their truth, knowing that those meant for them will never ask them to shrink. They understand that being themselves may cost them the world they once knew, but it will give them the world they were always meant to inhabit. And as they walk forward, lighter, clearer, fewer but deeper, they hold one truth quietly in their chest. Authenticity isn't lonely. It simply leaves no room for anything that isn't real. Strength rarely arrives with applause. It does not come from being surrounded, supported, or celebrated. It emerges in the places where no one is looking, in the quiet hours when a person sits with their own thoughts and realizes they must become their own anchor. There's a moment in every life where dependence collapses, where the illusion that someone else will save you fades, and a new force begins to rise inside. Many never reach that moment, but the ones who do often discover that solitude is not a punishment, but the birthplace of a deeper strength. He had spent years believing that closeness created safety, that if enough people stood around him, their presence would protect him from the storms within. But the crowd never truly shielded him. Their opinions were too loud, their expectations too heavy, their approval too inconsistent. And so the day came when he felt the weight of their voices pushing him further from himself, and something inside whispered, almost painfully, stand alone. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't rebellion. It was a quiet recognition that truth had been waiting for him in the one place he had avoided, his own inner world. Solitude is not the absence of people. It is the presence of oneself. There is a difference between being alone and being abandoned. He learned this slowly, in moments that didn't look dramatic from the outside, nights where he sat in silence and felt his mind ache from the noise it had absorbed, afternoons where he walked without a destination, realizing that without others to impress, his steps became lighter. It wasn't loneliness. It was decompression, a return to a natural state he had forgotten. Most people fear that place, not because silence is unbearable, but because it reveals what is real. And reality, unfiltered by validation or distraction, can feel overwhelming. But he learned to welcome it, to let the discomfort melt into understanding, to recognize that the parts of himself he had once judged were simply unpolished strength waiting for space to grow. I didn't break, he would think when the old fear resurfaced. I evolved. Self-trust does not appear suddenly. It forms like stone, layer by layer, pressure by pressure. At first, he questioned everything. Every choice felt uncertain. Every step felt fragile. But the more he navigated alone, the more he realized that uncertainty was not a flaw, but a sign that he was no longer moving on autopilot. When you stand alone, you stop borrowing confidence from others. You begin generating your own, and that is when real sovereignty forms. In the collective, individuality dissolves. People mirror each other to fit in, to avoid conflict, to escape judgment. But Carl Jung observed that true individuation pulls a person away from the collective current, forcing them to confront the depths no one else can navigate for them. And as he withdrew from that current, he noticed that much of what he believed about himself came from others, opinions masquerading as truths, expectations posing as identity. Alone, these illusions began to fall away. The mind becomes clearer in solitude. Patterns appear. Wounds speak. Desires reveal themselves without shame. He discovered that the need for external validation had not been a desire for love, but a fear of making his own choices. Validation was a crutch, comfortable, familiar, deceptive, but the longer he walked without leaning on it, the more natural the weight of independence became. He started trusting his instincts. He began hearing his own voice again, one that had been drowned out for years. There's a quiet power that develops when a person no longer seeks permission to exist. It does not shout. It does not demand recognition. It simply steadies the inner world, making everything less chaotic. Decisions become clearer. Boundaries become sharper. Emotional storms become manageable. He began to understand that the strength he admired in others had never come from their relationships or achievements. It came from their inner solidity, their ability to stand firmly in who they were, regardless of who approved. This shift did not make him cold. It made him whole. When people saw him now, they sensed something different. Not arrogance, but a groundedness that could not be easily shaken. Conversations changed. Expectations dissolved. He no longer played roles to fit into other stories. He no longer shrank to make others comfortable. Solitude had purified his identity, leaving only what was true. At times, the world tried to pull him back. Old voices resurfaced, asking why he had become more distant, more selective, more contained. They misinterpreted his silence as withdrawal, not realizing it was clarity. They saw fewer social ties and assumed weakness, never understanding that he had outgrown the need for noise. He had stopped filtering himself through the perceptions of others, and that transformation always unsettles those who depend on your previous version. Standing alone is not isolation. It is reclamation. It is a recognition that closeness with others is only meaningful when it does not cause closeness with oneself. He realized that even in a room full of people, one can feel empty, unseen, or misunderstood. And in a room with no one else, one can feel full, connected, anchored. The external environment matters far less than the internal one. He noticed something else as well. When he stopped relying on others for emotional stabilization, he became harder to manipulate. Emotional independence makes a person unpredictable to those who benefit from control. People who once sensed his insecurities could no longer find openings. Their opinions lost their power. Their disapproval lost its sting. Their expectations lost their authority. A person who stands alone becomes ungovernable. There's a profound calm that comes with that. The mind stops racing. The heart stops grasping. The soul stops begging. He no longer needed constant reassurance because he had built a foundation stronger than reassurance, self-respect. And once that formed, he began engaging with others not from need, but from choice. Relationships became healthier because they were no longer bargaining for belonging. Dreams became clearer because they were no longer filtered through the lens of what others would think. Pain became more bearable because he knew he had survived himself, which is the greatest test of resilience a person can face. Most people never learn this. They believe strength is a collective experience, something gained through alliances, communities, partnerships. But the deepest strength is internal, forged in stillness, carved through self-confrontation. Jung understood this well. The individual who learns to stand alone becomes psychologically complete. They no longer project their fears onto others or outsource their identity. They carry themselves with a quiet authority, one that does not depend on the collective for definition. The more he embraced solitude, the more he understood that inner sovereignty was not a destination, but a lifelong practice. Some days he felt unshakable. Other days the old patterns pulled at him, whispering temptations of comfort and conformity. But he kept returning to the still place inside, the one built through solitude, strengthened through honesty, refined through silence. As he continued on this path, he realized that solitude had taught him something irreplaceable. He no longer feared his own company. Many people spend their lives running from themselves, chasing distractions, clinging to relationships, hiding behind noise. But when you stop running, when you finally sit with your own mind without flinching, you gain a strength that cannot be taken away. There were moments where he recalled how afraid he used to be of being alone. The emptiness felt threatening back then, but now he saw that emptiness differently. It was not a void but a canvas, a space where new identity could grow without interference. He filled that space with self-awareness, with honesty, with quiet courage. And gradually, the emptiness became home. With time, he noticed he required less from the world. He did not crave constant affirmation. He did not chase attention. He did not fear silence. He felt full without external input. This frightened some people. They could no longer predict him, influence him, or box him into roles. A self-contained person is a mystery to those who depend on others for emotional supply. The greatest transformation came when he recognized that standing alone did not mean rejecting connection. It meant choosing connections aligned with truth. He became more discerning, not out of judgment, but out of self-preservation. He realized that not everyone deserved access to the inner world he had worked so hard to heal. Only those who respected his boundaries, values, and growth could enter. And so, he walked his path with a new kind of strength, one that did not need to be proven. He no longer feared losing people, because he understood that anyone who left simply made space for deeper alignment. He no longer feared misunderstanding, because he no longer needed to be seen to be real. He no longer feared solitude, because it had become the soil from which his inner sovereignty had grown. Standing alone had not made him harder. It had made him clearer. It had not made him distant. It had made him authentic. It had not made him cold. It had made him complete. And as he continued forward, quietly, steadily, resolutely, he realized that the strength he once saw from the world had been forming within him all along. He didn't break. He evolved. There comes a point in a person's life when the soul begins to speak louder than their habits, when the body tightens around certain people, even if their words sound kind, when a quiet instinct whispers warnings before the mind can explain them. It is in these moments that a deeper truth reveals itself. Not everyone deserves access to your inner world, and your soul knows it before you do. He learned this slowly, almost reluctantly, but once he saw it, he could no longer unsee it. Selectivity wasn't arrogance. It was protection. He once believed that openness was a virtue, that letting everyone in made him generous, compassionate, understanding. But openness without discernment is how the spirit fractures. It's how the wrong people slip through the cracks and plant doubts that take years to uproot. He realized that the heart, unguarded, becomes territory for anyone to shape. And so he began to listen more carefully, not to words, but to energy. Words lie, energy doesn't. There were moments when someone smiled, yet something inside him tensed, whispering, "Not everyone who smiles is safe." The warning felt irrational, but it was accurate. Every time, he learned the difference between personalities and intentions, between charm and character, between people who wanted to understand him and people who wanted to use him. There is a softness in the empathetic mind that can easily be molded by others. And for a long time, he mistook his sensitivity for a moral obligation to be available. But sensitivity without boundaries becomes self-betrayal. Eventually, he understood that he was not meant to absorb every emotion or entertain every presence. The soul has a way of pushing out what does not belong, no matter how polite the mind tries to be. He noticed he could no longer tolerate shallow conversations, the kind that hover on the surface but never touch anything real. They drained him, left him feeling unseen, unheard, misunderstood. It wasn't that he wanted intensity all the time. It was that he wanted authenticity. He wanted depth. He wanted people whose inner worlds were alive and textured and honest. People who spoke with their eyes, not just their mouths. People who could sit in silence and still be connected. Shallow people weren't bad. They just weren't for him. His nature required something richer. As he matured, Selectivity stopped feeling like loss and began feeling like alignment. He realized that emotional intelligence wasn't measured by empathy alone, but by discernment, the ability to see beyond personas, to sense intentions before they manifest, to know who is safe for his spirit and who is not. It became a form of self-respect, a sacred filter. Some people were meant to pass through, others were meant to remain outside. He no longer forced himself to justify the difference. There were times when people questioned his distance. They wondered why he didn't respond as quickly, why he wasn't as accessible as he used to be, why his circle seemed to shrink as his self-awareness grew. What they did not understand was that clarity always narrows the path. When a person truly begins to see, they begin to choose. And choosing means releasing what no longer resonates. The ones who complained were often the ones he had previously allowed too close. He began to notice patterns in people. The ones who drained him always rushed. The ones who respected him moved gently. The ones who carried hidden agendas always spoke too sweetly. The ones who were real never needed to impress. He started paying attention to how he felt after encounters, lighter or heavier, open or guarded, energized or depleted. The body always tells the truth. It recognizes dishonesty before the mind does, and he finally started trusting its signals. Sometimes when he walked into a room, he could sense immediately who resonated with his spirit and who didn't. It wasn't judgment. It was perception. Empaths often carry this quiet radar, though many never learned to use it consciously. But he did. He learned to identify the subtle tightness that warned him of people who wore masks too tightly. He learned to feel the discomfort that arose around those who demanded emotional access but offered none in return. And he learned to honor the calm that washed over him around souls that felt familiar, genuine, grounded. There were moments when he grieved the connections he had outgrown, not because they were meaningful, but because they had once been comfortable. Growth often requires releasing comfort, and release is always tinged with sadness, even when it's right. He understood that letting go was not an act of cruelty. It was an act of survival. The heart cannot carry everyone. Some weights must be put down for the soul to rise. With time, he discovered that high standards did not make him unkind. They made him honest. He no longer apologized for wanting depth. He no longer softened his edges to make others comfortable. He no longer lowered his expectations simply to fit into spaces where he was never meant to be. His standards were not walls. They were windows, showing him who could truly meet him and who could not. There was a kind of peace that came with this realization, the peace of not explaining himself, the peace of not chasing connections, the peace of knowing that genuine souls recognize each other effortlessly, without performance. He no longer sought attention. He sought resonance. And resonance cannot be faked. It vibrates in the space between two people, subtle yet unmistakable. He noticed he was no longer as easily impressed by outer qualities, beauty, status, confidence. What mattered was presence, humility, integrity, someone's ability to be real without hiding behind their persona. Surface-level charm lost its shine. Emotional maturity became the only currency that mattered. As the standards rose, his circle grew smaller, but the connections that remained were richer, deeper, stronger. These were people who respected his boundaries, understood his silences, and valued his sincerity. They didn't drain him. They nourished him. Being selective had not isolated him. It had refined his relationships. There were days where he still battled guilt for being distant. A small voice inside would whisper, "Are you being too harsh?" But another voice, deeper and older, would respond, "Protect what is sacred." And he knew which voice to trust. The world rarely teaches people to guard their inner world. It encourages constant availability, constant sharing, constant connection. But not all connections are healthy. Many are simply attachments dressed as relationships. He realized that the more selective he became, the more peaceful he felt. Drama disappeared. Chaos faded. Emotional turbulence settled. People who thrived on conflict no longer had access to him. People who manipulated through guilt no longer found openings. People who disrespected boundaries no longer had permission to return. Selectivity was not rejection. It was purification. There were moments when someone new would enter his life, and the old habit would attempt to resurface, the habit of giving too much, too soon. But then he remembered the cost. He remembered the exhaustion, the confusion, the emotional imbalance. So he slowed down. He observed. He let people reveal themselves naturally, without rushing to define the relationship. Those who aligned stayed. Those who didn't simply drifted away. He understood now that the soul is not a public space. It is a sanctuary. And sanctuaries are not meant to be open to everyone. Only those who approach with sincerity, humility, and respect deserve to enter. Not everyone who smiles is safe. He would remind himself gently, honoring the intuition that had protected him time and time again. Individuation, Jung taught, is the process of becoming who you truly are, free from the expectations of collective. But individuation always comes with a consequence. The more real you become, the more selective you must be, not out of superiority, but out of necessity. A grounded soul cannot coexist with chaotic energy. A self-aware mind cannot align with pretenders. A person who knows themselves becomes incompatible with those who don't. And so he walked through life with quiet strength, choosing carefully who he allowed near his inner world, not out of fear, not out of bitterness, but out of reverence for the person he had become. He had worked too hard to heal to let careless hands break him again. He had climbed too far inside himself to let the wrong people pull him backward. His selectivity was not a flaw. It was a form of wisdom. As he continued to grow, his energy became its own filter. People who resonated with him felt at ease, seen, understood. People who didn't resonate felt uncomfortable, exposed, unsettled. That was the nature of authenticity. It revealed what was real and dissolved what was not. He no longer needed to explain himself. His presence did the explaining for him. And so the path narrowed, but it became clearer. The noise faded, but the meaning deepened. The circle shrank, but the connection strengthened. He no longer felt lonely. He felt aligned. He no longer felt guarded. He felt discerning. He no longer gave pieces of himself to everyone. He gave his truth only to those who could hold it. This was his sacred filter, his shield, his self-respect, his protection. And for the first time in his life, he understood something profound. The soul does not want many people. It wants the right people. The few who see you, not the many who only look. The ones who enter gently. The ones who speak honestly. The ones who stay quietly. The ones who resonate deeply. Everyone else is meant to remain outside the gates, where their presence cannot disturb the peace he fought so hard to build within himself. There are moments in life when silence begins to feel less like an absence and more like a presence, a companion, a quiet room in the house of the self where truth whispers through the cracks. He began to understand this on the nights when he sat alone, lights dimmed, thoughts unguarded. Silence was not empty. It was where his real voice finally became loud enough to hear. And once he learned to listen, the world inside him became more interesting than the noise outside. People often misinterpreted his distance. They thought he was cold, uninterested, detached. But his distance was not a wall. It was a doorway to the inner landscape he had neglected for years while trying to fit into places that never felt right. He wasn't withdrawing from life. He was returning to himself. Some nights, he would catch himself staring into nothing, letting thoughts rise and dissolve like smoke. This emotion, what is it trying to teach me? He'd whisper silently. These were not moments of escape. They were acts of self-discovery. He started to see patterns, not just in others, but in himself. Emotional waves that repeated across different situations. Reactions that seemed almost scripted. The same heaviness at the same moments. The same tension around the same types of people. Introspection became his lantern in the dark, illuminating what had been shaping him without his consent. He began to recognize that most suffering doesn't come from life itself, but from the unconscious habits we carry into it. Habits learned in childhood. Habits absorbed from others. Habits born from wounds we never acknowledged. With each reflection, pieces of old experiences resurfaced, not to haunt him, but to be understood. He realized the mind has a way of protecting itself by burying anything it isn't ready to face. But buried things do not disappear. They wait. Jung called this a shadow. the collection of forgotten, rejected, denied parts of self. And he saw, sometimes painfully clearly, how those shadows shaped his fears, his choices, even the people he gravitated toward. There were evenings when he felt the quiet ache of old memories rising like ghosts, times when anger surfaced for no visible reason, or sadness flowed without a story, moments when anxiety tightened around his chest like an invisible rope. Instead of running from these feelings, he sat with them. He asked them questions. He treated them as visitors carrying messages from the deeper layers of his psyche. It wasn't easy. Shadow work never is. But in the silence, he found the courage to witness himself without judgment. The more he listened inward, the more he grew outward. When someone spoke to him with kindness, he noticed whether he truly believed it or whether an old wound whispered that he didn't deserve it. When he hesitated to set boundaries, he traced the hesitation back to a childhood fear of disappointing others. When he felt drawn to chaotic people, he questioned what part of him was still trying to fix what he couldn't fix in the past. His life became a map. Introspection became the legend. People often wondered how he stayed so calm in situations that shook others. What they didn't see were the countless nights he had spent learning his own storms, studying his own triggers, tracing his own emotional fingerprints. He had spent years navigating the landscapes of his mind. So when the world outside trembled, he already knew where to plant his feet. There were days when solitude felt like a sanctuary, a place where nothing demanded his attention except the truth. In this sanctuary, he discovered that wisdom is not something you collect. It's something you uncover. Each layer peeled back revealed another piece of himself he had neglected. He realized that every emotion carried a message, every fear carried a memory, every resistance carried a lesson. And so he approached his inner world with curiosity instead of fear. Sometimes he wondered why others ran from themselves, why silence made them uncomfortable, why they filled every moment with noise, distraction, conversation, stimulation. But he understood, when a person has never made peace with their own mind, solitude becomes a threat. Their inner world feels unfamiliar, uninhabited, dark. But for him, it was the opposite. The more he walked through the corridors of his own thoughts, the more those corridors filled with light. He began to see the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is the hunger for others. Solitude is the meeting with oneself. Most people confuse the two, believing that being alone means being incomplete. But he felt most whole when he was with himself. Not because he didn't need others, but because he had stopped needing validation to breathe. There were conversations he had with himself that no one else would ever hear. Conversations about fear, desire, purpose. Conversations where he admitted truths he had never dared to speak out loud. These inner dialogues became the foundation of his emotional strength. By listening inward, he learned how to respond outward. By understanding himself, he learned how to understand others. He noticed that introspective people always seemed to step back from the crowd, not because they lacked involvement, but because they saw too much. They processed too deeply. They felt the undercurrents of conversations, the unsaid tensions, the subtle shifts in tone. Their minds worked quietly, pulling threads together, seeing patterns others missed. Many called it overthinking, but he knew it was something else entirely. It was awareness. Awareness is a blessing that sometimes feels like a burden. To see beneath words, beneath actions, beneath appearances, it requires strength. Most people prefer the comfort of assumptions, but he couldn't unsee what he saw. And so, introspection became both his superpower and his sanctuary. There were times when he walked through the world with a softness that belied the depth of his inner life. To the untrained eye, he looked calm, gentle, unbothered, but within him, a quiet fire burned, a fire lit by self-knowledge, by truth, by the refusal to live unconsciously. People often misjudge him because he did not announce his inner battles. He moved with quiet dignity, allowing his understanding to speak through his presence rather than his words. The more he grew inward, the less he reacted outward. He no longer took things personally. He no longer felt the need to defend himself against misunderstandings. He no longer lost himself in the emotional turbulence of others. When someone projected their insecurities onto him, he saw it for what it was, a reflection of their own shadow, not his burden to carry. not his fault to fix. Silence became his teacher. It taught him to pause before responding, to breathe before reacting, to feel before speaking. This pause wasn't hesitation, it was mastery. The mastery of emotions, the mastery of impulses, the mastery of the self. Most people live in constant reaction, bouncing between triggers like a pinball. But he learned to stand still in the space between stimulus and response. That space became his power. Sometimes he found himself watching others closely, noticing the fears they tried to hide, the insecurity behind their arrogance, the loneliness behind their laughter, the longing behind their anger. Introspection had sharpened his perception. He didn't judge, he simply understood. And from that understanding came compassion. Not the naive kind that lets anyone in, but the wise kind that sees without absorbing, cares without collapsing. He realized that the wiser he became, the quieter he became. Wisdom doesn't crave attention. It moves gently, speaks softly, listens deeply. He found himself drawn to people who held the same quiet strength. People who weren't loud, but deep. People who chose their words with care and their relationships with intention. People who had met themselves in the silence and returned with humility rather than ego. There were moments when he questioned his journey. Was he becoming distant? Too selective? Too inward? But then a deeper voice rose within him. Not loud, but certain. You are not distancing yourself from the world. You are aligning yourself with truth. And that truth required solitude. It required reflection. It required the courage to walk into the chambers of his own mind without flinching. He learned to trust the insights that emerged from silence. They were often more accurate than anything he had been told. Insights about what mattered, what didn't, who was real, who wasn't. Insights about the life he was living versus the life he was meant to live. Intuition sharpened in solitude. Clarity bloomed in quiet. He realized something profound. Introspection does not pull you away from life. It prepares you for it. It helps you navigate relationships with grace, understand emotions with maturity, and walk your path with steadiness. It teaches you to see without judgment, feel without drowning, and think without spiraling. When a person knows their inner world deeply, the outer world becomes less overwhelming. Some evenings, he would sit in the stillness and feel a sense of gratitude wash over him. Gratitude for the struggles that had pushed him inward. Gratitude for the silence that had taught him to hear himself. Gratitude for the shadows that had shaped his strength. He understood now that the darkest parts of him were not to be feared. They were to be integrated. They were the missing pieces of his wholeness. And as he grew in this inner sovereignty, he became a person who moved through life like a lantern in the dark, quietly illuminating, softly understanding, deeply aware. He didn't need to announce his wisdom. It radiated from the way he carried himself, the way he spoke, the way he chose peace over chaos. Introspection had not made him distant. It had made him wise. It had not made him cold. It had made him clear. It had not made him alone. It had made him whole. And in that wholeness, he found a quiet truth that would guide him for the rest of his life. Everything you seek from the world begins with the world within. While others rush toward noise as if their identity depends on it, he moves in the opposite direction. There is something inside him that no longer responds to the urgency of the world, something that refuses to be pulled into the frantic rhythm that keeps most people distracted. He has learned, slowly and painfully, that meaning cannot be found in the places where noise is worshipped. It rises instead from the quiet spaces most people avoid. And so he follows those spaces, not because he feels superior, but because he feels called by something deeper than approval or belonging. He feels the subtle pull of a different kind of life, one shaped not by chaos, but by clarity. He didn't always understand this. For a long time, silence felt like a punishment, like an empty room where unwanted truths echoed too loudly. But with time, he realized silence wasn't empty at all. It was crowded with insights he had never allowed himself to hear. It was filled with memories that needed to be sorted, emotions that needed to be understood, and unlived parts of himself that had been suppressed for the sake of fitting in. The world taught him to run from this, to drown out the inner world with endless stimulation. But he grew tired of running. He grew tired of pretending that the answers he sought could be found anywhere except within. Eventually, he stopped resisting the quiet. And when he did, something began to shift. The shift wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable at first, but it was real. He began to watch himself the way one watches the sky before sunrise, knowing that the darkness is temporary, knowing that the light is coming. In the stillness, he started to sense a strange kind of expansion. His thoughts moved slowly, like clouds drifting without pressure. His emotions, once tangled and loud, began to settle into patterns he could finally see. And in those patterns, he recognized truths he had never dared to accept. Not all people were meant to walk with him. Not all connections were meant to last. Not every version of himself was meant to survive the journey. He understood now that growth often looks like distancing. It looks like stepping back from noise that once felt normal. It looks like saying less, feeling more, and choosing peace over performance. He used to believe the quiet made him weak, but now he sees how much strength it takes to stay, to sit, to listen to the mind without numbing it. There is courage in looking inward when everyone else is running outward. There is resilience in facing what the world avoids. And there is power, real, unshakable power, in trusting the evolution happening inside him, even when no one else can see it. The more he grew, the more the world around him seemed to shrink. Social expectations that once dictated his choices began to lose their grip. He stopped chasing trends, approval, and validation. He no longer felt the need to explain his distance or justify his solitude. It wasn't rebellion. It was transformation. His values were shifting away from what the collective demanded and toward what his soul required. The higher he climbed within himself, the less he resonated with the noise below. He realized something else too, something the mountain always teaches a climber. When you rise, you lose sight of the valley. The familiar hills disappear. The roads you used to walk no longer matter. You can't see the crowds anymore, and they can't see you. But that isn't loneliness. It's altitude. It's perspective. It's the price of clarity. And he was willing to pay it, even if it meant appearing distant to those who would never understand the shift happening within him. There were moments, of course, when doubt crept in, moments when he wondered if something was wrong with him, moments when the silence felt too loud, too deep, too revealing. In those moments, an inner voice whispered through the uncertainty, a voice he had come to trust. "I am not falling apart," he would tell himself. "I am unfolding." And the truth is, every unfolding requires space. Every transformation requires stillness. He didn't need to be surrounded to feel whole. He didn't need constant affirmation to feel real. His identity was no longer tied to the reactions of others. It was anchored in the quiet sense of becoming. He noticed that solitude, once frightening, had become a kind of sanctuary. Nothing superficial could survive in that space. Not the masks he once wore, not the roles he played, not the borrowed beliefs he carried. Solitude stripped him clean. It returned him to himself. And in that bareness, he found a kind of honesty the world rarely offers. The honesty of knowing who he is without witnesses, without applause, without influence. The noise outside had always tried to define him, but the silence inside allowed him to define himself. With this inner clarity came a strange calmness. External chaos no longer triggered urgency within him. He saw how quickly people reacted to things that didn't matter, how they let small inconveniences control their peace. But he couldn't go back to that version of himself. He couldn't unknow what he had learned in the quiet. He had become aware of the space between stimulus and response, a space where intention lives, where freedom lives. And he found that once a person discovers this space, they can no longer live unconsciously. He began responding to life differently, slower, more grounded, more aware. He chose presence over impulse, understanding over judgment, patience over reaction. He saw emotions not as things to escape, but as messengers carrying truths. He listened to them without running. He watched them without attaching. And because of this, the world around him seemed to lose its power to destabilize him. What once caused storms now barely stirred the surface. His mind, once a restless ocean, was becoming a still lake. This stillness made others uneasy. People who relied on chaos to feel alive didn't know how to connect with someone so internally anchored. They misunderstood his quiet as disinterest, his calmness as coldness, his independence as arrogance. But he didn't fight their perceptions. He had learned that people only understand you from the level they are on. Those who live in noise will always fear the quiet. Those who live in imitation will always distrust the authentic. And those who avoid themselves will always be uncomfortable around someone who does not. But he did not take this personally. He saw that every person lives in their own psychological weather. Some exist in storms they haven't learned to calm. Some live in fog they have never tried to clear. Some cling to wind because they're terrified of stillness. Their reactions were not reflections of his worth, but projections of their own inner climate. He could observe without absorbing. He could care without collapsing. He could love without losing himself. This was the beginning of his inner sovereignty. The moment he realized he could stand alone without feeling empty, he had become his own foundation. His peace depended on no one. His validation came from within. His sense of identity was no longer shaped by the collective consciousness, but by the quiet, steady voice of his own becoming. And that voice grew louder each time he trusted it. There came a moment, a quiet, almost invisible moment, when he realized he no longer feared solitude. He preferred it, not because he disliked people, but because he finally liked himself. He found energy in his own company. He found clarity in reflection. He found meaning in silence. He found growth in stillness. And with this came an unexpected revelation. Solitude wasn't withdrawal from life. It was preparation for a deeper kind of living. He discovered that isolation and solitude are not the same. Isolation is emptiness. Solitude is fullness. Isolation is being disconnected from others. Solitude is being reconnected with yourself. And once a person tastes that reconnection, they stop craving the world's noise. They begin craving their own truth. They begin craving alignment, not attention. His mind continued to evolve. He no longer responded automatically to old triggers. He questioned patterns, examined fears, explored hidden motives. He noticed how much of his past behavior had been shaped by conditioning. The need to belong, the pressure to conform, the fear of being misunderstood. None of those impulses guided him anymore. He had stepped out of psychological gravity, out of the orbit of collective. He was shaping his own path, one internal insight at a time. Sometimes the evolution felt like loss. Old identities fell away. Old relationships grew distant. Old dreams no longer fit. But beneath the loss, there was relief. He was no longer pretending. He was no longer performing. He was no longer shrinking to fit the spaces he had outgrown. He was expanding, even when the world couldn't see it, especially when the world couldn't see it. As he rose into this higher version of himself, his inner world began to feel different. There was a new warmth, a new steadiness, a new sense of direction. He felt guided, not by external voices, but by a deeper intelligence, the wisdom of the quiet mind. It didn't shout, it whispered, but its whispers carried more truth than any noise he had ever followed. He began to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time, a subtle, growing connection to something larger than himself. Not the collective, not society. Something older, something deeper, something like the soul's instinct for expansion. In that instinct, he felt a pull toward becoming the person he was always meant to be, not the version he was taught to be. And then, in a moment of rare clarity, the words rose inside him, steady and unmistakable. I am not alone, he realized. I am becoming. The words didn't come from fear. They came from truth, the truth that solitude had not emptied him, but transformed him, the truth that silence had not isolated him, but elevated him, the truth that the quiet mind is not fragile, but fierce. This is the evolution of the quiet mind, the journey from seeking noise to choosing meaning, from losing oneself in the world to finding oneself in the inner depths, from depending on collective to standing sovereign in one's own being. And though the world may never understand this kind of transformation, he doesn't need it to. He is no longer living for understanding. He is living for alignment. The quiet mind is not a retreat. It is a rising, and he rises a little more each day. Some people look fragile from the outside. They seem delicate, tentative, almost like a whisper in a storm. Yet the world has no idea how many storms they have already endured. Life has tested them in ways most cannot imagine, and they have emerged unshaken, carrying a calmness that is almost imperceptible but unbreakable. Their strength is quiet. It does not announce itself in loud declarations or visible gestures. It is woven into the way they stand, the way they breathe, the way they navigate a world that often misunderstands them. You might think they are weak because they walk alone, because they smile softly, because they do not chase attention. But in that very solitude, they have cultivated something that cannot be borrowed, cannot be taught, and cannot be shaken by circumstance. They have learned that stability is not built from the applause of others, nor from the constant validation of society. Stability lives within. It lives in the choice to remain anchored when the world feels chaotic, to observe without reacting, to hold space for oneself even when no one else does. For those who walk alone, the storms of life are not reasons for despair, but instruments of growth. Each disappointment, each betrayal, each moment of isolation becomes a teacher. The lesson is always the same. You can survive. You can thrive. You can rise. Even when the world would have you believe otherwise. I no longer need a crowd to feel whole. They whisper to themselves, and in that whisper, a fortress is built around the soul. The quiet resilience they carry is almost invisible, but it is powerful. It is a resilience that comes from having faced oneself in the stillness of solitude. It is a resilience that comes from understanding that no one else's approval can define your worth. It is a resilience that grows when every moment of emotional chaos is met with introspection rather than reaction. They have walked the path of self-reliance not out of pride, but out of necessity. And in doing so, they have discovered a truth most people never see. Strength is often quiet, and it is often misunderstood. The world rewards noise, dramatics, and constant proof of vitality. It judges people by the number of friends they keep, the breadth of their influence, the speed at which they move through life. But those who walk alone move differently. Their path is slower, deliberate, intentional. They do not need to measure themselves against external timelines or expectations. They learn to stand in their own gravity, to hold their center even when everything around them is shifting. And in that steadiness, a power emerges that the world cannot sway. Life has a way of testing those who are quiet, precisely because it knows their strength is hidden. There are moments when loss hits without warning, when people drift away, when the familiar support structures crumble. Most would panic. Most would seek distraction, noise, or company to soothe the shock. But the ones who have practiced solitude, who have walked long stretches of life without leaning on others, know something different. They bend, but they do not break. They stumble, but they rise. Their inner foundation has been built brick by brick, moment by moment, in times when no one was watching. Each challenge becomes a test of endurance, each hardship meditation on inner fortitude. It is not that they are untouched by pain. Far from it. They feel it deeply, more deeply than many would dare to allow. But their relationship with pain is transformative rather than destructive. Pain becomes a mirror, a lantern, a guide. They do not run from it, because they have learned that running only prolongs suffering. They allow it to teach them, to strengthen them, to deepen their understanding of life and themselves. In that way, quiet resilience is also quiet wisdom. It is a capacity to observe without being overwhelmed, to integrate without losing oneself, to rise without being noticed. They understand the paradox of social invisibility. The fewer people who truly see them, the more they cultivate a presence that cannot be imitated. Solitude is their training ground, the place where they practice patience, self-regulation, and inner observation, while others are distracted by the noise of opinion, by the pressure of conformity, by the constant push for connection. They are learning the language of their own psyche. They learn to read the hidden currents of their emotions, to recognize patterns before they escalate, to see motivations both within and outside themselves. This level of perception cannot exist in crowds or constant social immersion. It requires stillness. It requires observation. It requires courage. The center of their being becomes unmovable. Nothing external has the power to destabilize them unless they allow it. They have witnessed life's unpredictability, yet have discovered that the only truly uncontrollable factor is the mind's response. And they have chosen mastery over reaction. A smile, a harsh word, a betrayal, a sudden shift in circumstance. These things touch them, but they no longer shatter them. They respond instead of react. They observe instead of assume. They move with intention instead of impulse. Even their relationships are different. They do not attach out of fear, nor do they cling to validation. They attach to resonance, to connection that honors both parties' integrity. Shallow interactions tire them. Performative friendships repel them. But the bonds they do cultivate are deep, unshakable, and rare. The world might see their circle as small, but it is curated with precision, built on the unspoken understanding that strength is not diluted by quantity. Each person allowed inside their inner world is a person who respects the silent power that lives there. Each presence is earned, not taken. They understand, often intuitively, that strength is invisible because it is internal. It does not announce itself in drama, in bravado, or in visible conquest. It manifests in stability, composure, and the ability to remain grounded while the world swirls around them. It manifests in the capacity to sit with uncertainty without panic, to move through fear without collapse, and to witness chaos without adopting it. There is a discipline in this kind of resilience, a rigor that is rarely acknowledged, and yet it is life-sustaining. The lessons learned in solitude translate into every part of their existence. Work, relationships, creative pursuits, and personal growth are approached with clarity that outsiders may misinterpret as detachment. But detachment is not the right word. There is engagement, yes, careful, intentional engagement, but it is guided by awareness rather than impulse. They have observed the superficial and the transient and know the cost of surrendering oneself to it. They have chosen instead to invest their energy where it carries meaning, where it carries depth, where it reflects alignment with inner truth. Even their failures are different. They fail, yes, but they fail consciously, deliberately, choosing lessons over embarrassment, growth over comfort. Every setback is an opportunity to see themselves more clearly, to refine the foundation that others assume was always solid. They understand that resilience is not absence of struggle, but the ability to endure it without being undone. And in that endurance, they discover something remarkable. The more they lean into solitude, reflection, and alignment, the less life can shake them. They carry this quiet resilience in the way they hold their bodies, in the measured pace of their steps, in the calm inflection of their voice. It is not ostentatious. It does not demand recognition, but it is powerful in its subtlety. Those who encounter it sense it immediately, even if they cannot name it. The presence of someone who has cultivated unmovable strength is palpable. It radiates without effort. It influences without intention. It protects without aggression. And there is liberation in this power. They no longer fear being alone because they have become their own companion. They no longer crave approval because they are grounded in self-acceptance. They no longer panic when plans falter because they know the core of themselves is intact. I no longer need a crowd to feel whole. They reflect quietly, and in that sentence is the truth of everything they have learned. They are enough, fully and entirely, without external proof. Yet their resilience is not rigid. It is fluid. It bends under pressure, but does not break. It adapts without losing identity. It flows without losing purpose. Life continues to test them, as it tests all beings, but each test sharpens rather than diminishes. They move through challenge with a kind of elegant patience, as if every moment of adversity were a sculptor shaping the contours of a hidden masterpiece. And perhaps it is. Perhaps the human soul, when given silence, solitude, and introspection, becomes its own work of art, deliberate, and resilient. In the quiet spaces between action and reflection, they have learned to find stillness even in movement. They have learned that power is not loud, that strength is not performance, that endurance is not always visible. They have become familiar with the paradox that the world seldom appreciates. Those who appear most delicate often carry the most formidable strength. Their unshakable presence is a result of long years of learning to stand alone, to observe, to integrate, and to trust themselves. And so they move forward, not because they are fearless, but because they are grounded, not because they are invincible, but because they have cultivated a center that cannot be moved by circumstance, not because they reject connection, but because they have learned to recognize the weight of true alignment. The quiet resilience they carry is a shield and a gift. It protects them from false attachments, from chaos, from surrendering themselves in order to belong. And it offers a subtle invitation to others to walk with them, yes, but on equal footing in respect of depth and truth. They understand that few will ever comprehend this strength. Few will recognize the countless internal battles, the long nights of reflection, the disciplined cultivation of the mind and spirit. But understanding is unnecessary. Validation is irrelevant. They have built something that transcends opinion. They have built a self that cannot be moved. They have built a foundation that stands firm because it has been tested and retested and tempered in silence. And in the stillness of a quiet morning, when the world is not watching, they acknowledge it. I am enough. I am whole. I am resilient. The words carry no arrogance, only truth. They are a reminder that life cannot dismantle what has been forged from awareness, solitude, and conscious strength. They have discovered the hidden power that the world overlooks, the power of quiet resilience. And it is this power that shapes not only their journey, but the way they engage with the world, calm, deliberate, unshakable, and profoundly human. Some will never understand. Many will misinterpret. But those who carry quiet resilience do not live for understanding. They live for alignment, for integrity, for the mastery of themselves. They have learned that the greatest strength is not seen, and the most enduring power is cultivated in the silence others fear. And so they continue, walking alone at times, walking with select few at other times, but always walking ground in the certainty that nothing external can undo what has been forged within. The very traits that make you alone are the ones that make you extraordinary. It is a paradox the world struggles to understand. While many chase approval, validation, and the comfort of conformity, you have chosen a different path, one of quiet discernment, of deliberate separation from the noise, of deep communion with yourself. People may see your solitude and mistake it for weakness. They may measure your life by the size of your circle, by the visibility of your presence, by the outward signals of social approval. Yet beneath this apparent isolation lies a richness that few will ever perceive, a depth that is cultivated in silence, and a strength that grows in ways subtle and profound. You have learned, slowly and often painfully, that being different is not a curse. It is a gift. Each moment spent alone, each conversation avoided because it carried no truth, each choice made in alignment with your inner compass rather than the collective expectation, has shaped something rare. The world rewards mimicry, yet the soul rewards courage. And the courage to stand apart, to observe, to resist the pressures of conformity, is the first mark of your evolution. You were never broken. You were awakening. In the quiet hours, when the clamor of life recedes, you begin to recognize the wisdom you carry. It is not loud or boastful. It does not announce itself in accolades or attention. It emerges gradually, through reflection, through patience, through the consistent practice of self-honesty. Every disappointment, every betrayal, every moment when you felt misunderstood became a teacher. Each encounter that left you questioning yourself was an opportunity to learn discernment, to sharpen your perception of what aligns with your essence and what does not. In solitude, clarity grows. In stillness, insight deepens. The paradox of being misunderstood has accompanied you for as long as you can remember. Others interpret your quiet as distance, your selectivity as arrogance, your independence as emotional coldness. And yet you know the truth. These traits are not barriers, but shields. They protect your growth, your energy, your integrity. The very qualities that isolate you from the superficial are the same qualities that allow the genuine to find their way to you. Not everyone will appreciate it, but those who do resonate at the same frequency of authenticity and depth. You have learned that life is not measured by how many people walk beside you, but by how aligned you are with yourself. Approval is transient, company is fleeting, but self-alignment endures. It is a flame that no external circumstance can extinguish. In choosing solitude over distraction, reflection over reaction, depth over conformity, you have cultivated a foundation that is unshakable. You move through the world not as a shadow of expectation, but as a conscious presence, deliberate in thought, intentional in action, and unwavering in principle. There is a quiet joy in this awareness. It is not the loud exhilaration of recognition, but a deep satisfaction that arises from knowing you are not lost in the currents of other people's priorities. You navigate your life with precision, choosing carefully where to invest your attention your time, your energy, your heart. You no longer scatter yourself across the expectations of others. You no longer dilute your essence to fit a mold that was never meant for you. Instead, you nurture the alignment between your inner world and your outer life. And in doing so, you experience a freedom few ever understand. Your discernment has become a form of spiritual evolution, the capacity to see beneath the surface, to recognize intentions before words are spoken, to sense resonance before connection is formed, is a rare gift. It is a kind of internal alchemy, the transformation of experience into insight, of solitude into strength, of self-reflection into wisdom. Those who spend their lives in distraction will never appreciate this process, because they never confront themselves. But you, who have walked through silence, have faced the depths of your own mind and heart, and emerged wiser, more grounded, more alive. And yet, being different carries its own challenges. There are moments when you long for understanding, for companionship, for recognition. There are times when the world feels heavy with incomprehension, when the familiar ache of isolation returns, reminding you that your path is not easy. But these moments are temporary, and they are not signs of failure. They are part of the journey, signals that you are navigating a territory that few dare to enter, a space of self-mastery, authenticity, and true growth. In these moments, you remind yourself that your solitude is not emptiness. It is sacred. It is a crucible in which your character, clarity, and courage are forged. As you move through life, you notice how the smaller your circle, the deeper your connections become. Superficial bonds fade naturally, leaving only those that are authentic, reciprocal, and resonant. Each relationship is no longer a transaction of validation or status, but an exchange of truth. You have learned to honor the value of presence and to recognize the cost of distraction. The world rushes forward, consumed by noise, yet you move intentionally. Carry within you a quiet wisdom, a reflective power, a clarity of vision that guides every step. The transformation you have undergone is subtle but profound. It is not always visible to the world, and it rarely seeks recognition, but it manifests in your posture, in your choices, in the steadiness of your mind, and in the serenity that radiates from within. People may misinterpret your quiet, but those attuned to depth recognize it immediately. There's a kind of magnetic stillness to someone who has mastered themselves, a presence that requires no words, yet communicates an entire universe of understanding. You have learned that true evolution does not come from external rewards, applause, or approval. It comes from moments spent facing yourself without distraction, from nights of reflection, from the courage to feel fully and think independently. In these silent hours, the mind sharpens, the spirit grows, and the soul expands. You become aware of the patterns that govern your life, the impulses that drive your decisions, and the values that shape your path. And in this awareness, freedom emerges. Freedom from comparison, freedom from expectation, freedom from the subtle chains that bind those who live only in the eyes of others. This is the gift of being different, the capacity to live deeply, to perceive clearly and act authentically. It is a reward of the solitary journey, of walking paths that others fear, of enduring periods of loneliness that are misunderstood by the world. The gifts you carry, discernment, resilience, insight, and alignment, are earned, not given. They are the result of sustained courage, sustained reflection, and sustained commitment to your own becoming. Few will ever grasp the magnitude of this work, yet the value of it is immeasurable. In embracing your difference, you also embrace a profound truth. You were never broken. You were never too much or too little. You were simply evolving, stepping into a form of being that requires more subtlety, more awareness, more integrity than society often rewards. The world may not celebrate this growth, but it does not diminish it. Every quiet victory, every lesson learned in silence, every conscious choice to stand in alignment with your essence contributes to a life of extraordinary depth. And so, in the still moments when reflection meets awareness, you acknowledge it. I was not lonely, I was transforming. This is the final realization, the gentle closure, the recognition that your path, though solitary at times, has been luminous. The traits that once seemed like barriers, quietness, selectivity, introspection, independence, are the very traits that illuminate your journey. They are the markers of awakening, the proof of evolution, and the quiet crown that rests on your mind and spirit. You have walked through the silence. You have walked through the incomprehension. You have walked through the doubt and emerged intact, aligned, and profoundly aware. And in this awareness, there is joy not of clamor, but of clarity. There is fulfillment, not of abundance, but of precision. There is a strength, not measured by others, but by the depth to which you have dared to become yourself. The gift of being different is finally understood. It is not a burden. It is not a punishment. It is the rarest of treasures. The emergence of a self that is whole, sovereign, and alive in a way that the crowd cannot comprehend. And as you continue to navigate life, this awareness carries you forward, grounded in truth, attuned to resonance, aligned with essence, and quietly radiant in the brilliance of your own becoming.